and welcome back to Good Morning Sri Lanka. And as I told you, we have the authoress of In an Island of 1,000 Mirrors. And hello Naomi, welcome to Good Morning Sri Lanka.
Hi, good to be here.
So let me just read to you something I read about Naomi Munavira before we get to the interview. In an Island of 1,000 Mirrors, Naomi Munavira writes with ferocity, fire and poetry of the incomprehensible madness of civil war and those caught up in it. Another, whether in the villages or the city, in Sri Lanka or abroad. So, and it says it's a masterful rendition and her debut novel as well. So, Naomi, let me get to this. Tell us a little bit about yourself. Now, I said that you are maybe not Sri Lankan, or maybe you are. Your story from Nigeria to California and now back to Sri Lanka. And tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, it's been quite a journey, a lot of sort of diasporic movements. My family left Sri Lanka in '76 when I was 3 years old, and we moved to Nigeria, and we were there for 9 years. So from 3 to 12, I was there, and then we actually moved to California.
Okay.
But all through my childhood, all through growing up in Nigeria and Los Angeles, we would come back to Sri Lanka for a month every year.
Okay.
So.
And how did you come into writing in the first place? I mean, did you always do it? I understand you were doing a PhD and then suddenly this book came up. And tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah. I mean, I was always like an incredibly voracious reader. You know, I think a lot of writers, I mean, I think, 100% of kids that are going to grow up and be writers are just want to read everything that they can possibly read, like whether it's a newspaper or like the newspaper wrapping of like Peanuts or something, you want to read everything. And my journey to becoming a writer was very much just I had this insatiable need to read everything, and I mistook that for wanting a PhD in English literature, which was a great journey because what you do is you read a lot and you start to analyze how books work, and I got all the way to the end of that, and I was ready to write my dissertation, and I realized that I didn't want to write about other people's fiction. I wanted to write my own.
Okay, you felt that what you want to read needs to be written.
Yeah, there was just this the story I wanted to read wasn't available, and there's this great quote by Toni Morrison that says, if there's a book you want to read that hasn't been written, you have to write it. And I think that was sort of the moment of there was this push, and I never knew if anybody would ever read it, like if it would ever get published. I mean, publication is such a difficult thing to do, especially these days, that I didn't really imagine that would happen, but I knew that I wanted to write this book.
We'll come to the publication. Yeah. But now, Naomi, by reading, a surface reading of your book, the reviews and so on, told me that it deals with the war. It deals with before the war, just a little bit after independence in Sri Lanka in '48, and leading on to possibly the end of the conflict. Now, tell us a little bit the gist of the book. I understand there are 3 characters, 3 women, and their life in voice. Am I correct?
Yes. So actually, it is 3 women, but the story is told in first person by 2 of those women. It's a Sinhala girl who grows up in Colombo and then immigrates to Los Angeles, and then the other
because of the war.
Yes. They immigrate in '83. They see a lot of violence, and the family decides to leave. The other voice is Saraswati, who is a Tamil girl growing up in the north, in the midst of the warfare. So I start with the Sinhala voice, and she talks about living in Colombo, the war starting, the way that it sort of builds very slowly and then sort of erupts. And then the later part of the book intersplices her voice with the Tamil girl, so they sort of layer.
Right. Now, I find it absolutely interesting, Naomi, that you were able to put in 2 narratives, a Sinhalese narrative and a Tamil narrative. Now, talking in the first person, a narrative of 2 different people. And that's a difficult task. But before we get into that, I think you have a little excerpt for us which you'd like to read.
Sure, I'd love to. And this actually, we were talking about what excerpt to read, and it made sense to read this one because it happens right after the British leave. So this is '48, and the British are finally leaving. Colonization has ended. Behind the retreating Englishman, on the new nation's flag, is poised a stylized lion, all curving flank and ornate muscle, a long, cruel sword gripped in its front paw. It is the ancient symbol of the Sinhala who believe that they are descended from the lovemaking between an exiled Indian princess and a large jungle cat. A green stripe represents that small and much tossed Muslim population. An orange stripe represents the larger Tamil minority. But in the decades that are coming, race riots and discrimination will render the orange stripe inadequate. It will be replaced by a new flag. On its face, a snarling tiger, all bared fang and bristling whisker. If the idea of militancy is not conveyed strongly enough, dagger-clawed paws burst forth while crossed rifles rear over the cat's head. A rifle-toting tiger, a sword-gripping lion. This is a war which will be waged between related beasts.
Absolutely interesting. I love how you've connected how the flag came and how the land with the stored. I mean, we never thought about those things. I mean, it's just the flag, the national flag.
Yeah.
But what it might mean to someone is indeed fascinating, and how those two animals and the two flags and how that clash comes. Now, to my question about the narratives, how did you come about this task? Was it a difficult task to have two separate narratives? And
it was quite difficult. I mean, I've sort of also a thing I want to say is, like, growing up in the West, I had a lot of questions about whether I had legitimacy in telling this story. So the fact, we'll get to this, but the fact that it's published by a Sri Lankan publishing house is a really big deal to me.
Right.
And then coming up with the narratives, the Sinhala girl's voice was easier for me. I mean, it's not me, it's not an autobiography, it is fiction. So it was closer to my experience. But I did a lot of research. I read absolutely everything I could. I read fiction, I read non-fiction, I read everything I could find. And Saraswati's voice, the young Tamil girl, her experience is like very different to mine. She's surrounded by the war. I don't want to give away too much, but she does eventually join the Tigers, and there's a long narrative involved with that. But, at some point her voice started coming to me, and it felt very natural to tell the story from that place. I think what a good writer does is connects with the character, and the character becomes real enough where they carry the narrative, and it feels normal.
Right. Did you meet anyone when you were abroad who could actually tell you the tale of Tamil who had to leave the country or so on?
Yeah. I have really good friends that are like Tamil refugees that came because of the war. So,
all right.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Now, as a child, now you told me that you used to visit here every year. I mean, you've been here since 2002 or so.
I haven't been back since 2002.
Okay.
But before that, we used to
come every year. Now, you'd have seen it. I mean, you'd have seen everything in the news from what you hear, bombs. I read somewhere you had discussed how violence is normalized, how a bomb in the bus is like, how many people are dead. I mean, that's how we used to think about it. That was very interesting. Now, tell me a little bit about how that affected your book. When you visit to Sri Lanka, you would have seen the progress.
Right. So I didn't actually see anything too terrible, but it's sort of on the edges of your consciousness. Like when you're growing up abroad, when there's a phone call in the middle of the night, you're scared anyway, but when you're from Sri Lanka, it's like, God, did someone get blown up? What happened? There's that sort of tension constantly. Clearly not the same as growing up here and actually like going through it. I had a tiny glimmer of what it was like. I was here somewhere in the 90s, and this was completely not related to the war, we found out later, but we were at a flower show. And it was my whole family. We were at this flower show. My aunt is a horticulturalist, and the place got bombed. And we learned later it was like gang violence or something. And nobody died, but they were bringing out stretchers of people. There's blood, etc., etc. And on the wall near where we had been about 10 minutes before, there were pock marks from the ball bearings. And like coming from America, being this American kid, it's like, wow. That was very close,
So coming up to 2002, I suppose all those memories would have probably propelled you to... Right,
absolutely. But what was really interesting is that night we went to dinner at my aunt's house, And we were joking about it, and it was very normalized. And I think that was a moment where I said, wow, this is just so normalized, and this is what you have to do.
Right.
If you're going to live here, you can't sort of freak out about it. You have to go on with your normal life.
Okay.
And that's what I was talking about.
Right. Now, Naomi, being a diaspora writer, of course, there is a bad tag in Sri Lanka where when you say diaspora, it's a Tamil diaspora that you get put into, but you're a diaspora writer, you have migrated from this country. Now, when it comes to that, do you think that there is a sense of people thinking that you might be inclined to take one side? Now, you have the Tamil and the Sinhalese narrative. Do you think that you attempted to have a neutral story, or you have a neutral story, or how did it work?
Absolutely. I mean, that was like my absolute priority in writing this book, was to show that people suffered, you know, the sort of racial labels and the culture. At the end of the day, people died and lost their lives and suffered from both sides, and that was really my main motivation in telling this story. I had like absolutely no compulsion towards telling one side more clearly, or sort of, I was very interested in neutrality and showing what everyday people had to go through.
Right.
So if you get to the end of my book, you sort of see how the war manifests in terms of what happens to both these families. Yep.
Now, there are a couple of books I told you about which I've read personally, which are related to the war, during the war, most of them, I think.
Right.
Now, how would you put your book into that mold? Is it a different book? What does a reader expect from your book about? Is it just the war? Is it perspective? Or?
Oh, well, you know, it's not just the war. There's like love stories, and there's quite a bit of hope too. So I don't want to make it seem like this is just suffering and blood and like awful stuff. It's quite at the end of the day, it's quite a hopeful book. You know, the writer that I think I'm closest to is actually Michael Ondanji. Like, his style is something that I think I'm closest to.
Right.
And yeah, I am absolutely a diaspora writer because I do live in the States, you know, so I've got a foot in each place. You know, when I'm in America, nobody thinks, oh, you're American. They're like, where are you from?
Yeah.
Well, then I say Sri Lanka. When I'm here, they say, well, you're not from here. Like, where are you from? Okay, I'm from America. So what am I closest thing, Sri Lankan American with a little bit of Nigeria. You know, it's a mix, right? It's like, I'm sort of a global creation, so there's no way I could have written a fully Sri Lankan book or a fully American. In America, this book, it hasn't come out yet, but the tone is more British, so you know what I mean? It's British South Asian.